Okay, so what we have here, this is my drawing, my initial drawing, and what I do is the old-fashioned way. I'll put a graphite pencil on the back of it, transfer the image onto my watercolour paper, which has been stretched the night before, and by stretched I mean put it in the bathtub and then tape it down with paper tape, and it will dry perfectly flat every time. So I can put as much water on there as I like and it won't buckle. Okay, and this here is masking fluid, drawing gum, and it's like a rubbery type thing that I put on with a ruling pen, because otherwise I ruin all my paintbrushes. So I've already put this on to save us some time, and I just mask out the area of the little possum and the star. That's got to dry, which this is already dried, and then it's good to paint. So I can paint over this and it won't interfere with the possum or the star. And once this background's dry, then we can peel it off.
Excellent.
Which is good. Dusting brush. I don't use my fingers or my hands because you put too much oil from your hands, even though you might think it's not on there. It is. Okay. Big brush. Put some water down first. Just dampen the paper. This is going to paint a background sky. Through this book it was all dark blue skies with lots of stars. So we've got to paint the blue first and just see the shadow of that. And on the bigger sheets I would wet the whole paper first. Okay. These have all been done in watercolours. So my palette, which once you wet it, it all comes back to life again, which is great. Let's test my colour. We have two blues in this background. Off you go. So the first part of it is very light. And see, if the brush goes over where that gum is, it doesn't matter. This is going to dry back differently too. So sometimes you don't even know how it's going to turn out until it dries. So it's always best to paint on the lighter side first. This gives us our light halo effect. This is a phthalo blue. It's a dust. Sometimes I actually make the mistake of dipping my paintbrush in my cup of tea first, so I've got to make sure that I don't do that. Alright, now this blue here is very dark.
They do look very different.
Yeah, and
Nice.
this will just bleed in. So it's quite a process to get the background down first, and then it's literally waiting and watching paint dry to be able to paint the next layer. And I actually use the same process whether I'm working in watercolour or acrylic. All of my previous books were done, apart from Bums and Tums, all of them were done in acrylic, so this was a nice change of style.
Do you have a preference?
I'm really liking the watercolour at the moment. especially in the summer, it's easier to work with.
Yeah.
When I was painting Captain Kangaroo Saves the Day, it was 40 degrees for a week, and the paint was drained on the brush before I could get it down onto the paper. So that was crazy. The acrylic's good because it's forgiving. If you make a mistake, you can paint over it.
Yeah.
You make a mistake with a watercolour, you've got to start again.
Yeah.
So, unless you work in light layers, then you have a little bit of flexibility. So this actually needs to go down quite dark because it's going to dry back. Sometimes I'll come back and work into it, but not very often. I like to get the background down accurate straight off, because with the watercolour, because you get these really nice whispering,
blends.
these really nice effects, and if you work back into it, you'd lose it. It goes. And this is a 300-gram watercolour paper that I'm working on. I like the heavier stuff. When they dry back and they have the finished artwork, it just has a bit more guts to it. Because I tend to put lots of paint on these backgrounds. This is going to, lots of water here as well, is going to give us lots of nice variation in the sky. Because even though it's night time, I didn't want to paint it black. I don't actually have black in my palette. I don't use it at all because it's too dull.
Yeah.
Yep. It's usually, I usually use either a mixture of a colour like this, which is in Datharone blue, very dark blue, or a moon glow, which is a very dark, deep purple. They're the colours that I'll normally use instead of black.
It's really just about creating light and dark, isn't it?
It
is. You don't need black to do that.
No, and it gets quite dull. So the eyes on these little possums are actually created in a mixture of Payne's grey and Datharone blue, or a burnt umber in there as well. So lots of different colours to create a deeper, richer tone. Because when it prints too, the colour's going to sink back a little bit. So you've got to allow for that. So this is looking quite good.
It's very vibrant. I love that blue.
Yeah, it's very vibrant. I always paint as bright as I can. When it's printed, it's going to dull off a little bit. That's just the printing process. They do the best job they possibly can, and they do an awesome job. But it does. The books are printed in what they call CMYK, so every colour is made up of cyan, magenta, yellow and black. So they can't reproduce these vibrant blues accurately, but they do the best job they can. So if I paint it as bright as I possibly can, then it's up to them.
They have a better chance.
They have a better chance.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so I think we should just about leave this one for now. That's got a nice
That's beautiful.
a nice halo effect around the star. And it is watching paint dry.
Yeah, no,
We'll
that's
watch
all
the paint
right.
dry and then we'll come back.
No, excellent. Sounds good.
Look at that, we're dry. We can see these wonderful little effects coming through here, and even these effects of the variation of the blue tone has come up really nice.
Which is exact if you were to look up at the night sky away from city lights.
Yes, you get all that
You
variation.
would see that. Beautiful.
So the next step, this is a very technical step of throwing paint on there basically. So this is acrylic to get our extra little stars in.
Yep.
So we just need a little piece of this. And here we go. I'm going to water that down a little bit. When I am painting acrylics, I tend to use these, what do they call them? toolbox kits, or they use them for fishing hooks and stuff.
Yeah, tackle box.
Things, yes. And I put my paint in there because having a little boy as well, you know, every 5 minutes you can get interrupted, so you can just put the lid down and your paint will keep
a bit longer.
Yeah. So I use a spray bottle to keep that moist, and put a wet paper towel in there, and it will keep it for up to a week.
Oh, excellent.
Which is great, because I used to waste so much paint. Okay, so I've just made that a little bit runny. So I went through numerous processes of trying to work out how to get my stars looking better. The old toothbrush trick, but that didn't work. So just a medium-sized paintbrush, and a matter of tapping it onto the...
Oh, that's beautiful.
Yeah. So it's very technical.
It
took me 5 years of uni to learn this. And if you do it the other way though, it'll splatter lines. So I actually discovered that it actually took me a little while to work out this was the best way to do it. But it gives us that nice star. So everybody can try this at home, you know. You can paint your own little possum. It's not that hard. You've got the colouring in sheet you can trace him off of. Okay, so there is our stars. They will dry back. Get rid of the ones that are just around there, because you won't be able to see those anyway. So that gives us a really nice starry sky.
It's beautiful.
Now it's time to take the masking fluid off. So this is, I don't even know what you call these things, but they're very good for removing the masking fluid. So I used to do it with my finger, but it damages the surface of the paper, and you get oil from your fingers on there. So this is the best way to get it off. And it's just rubber, and when it comes off you can see the paper underneath is perfectly white.
Cool. So you've effectively made a little stencil, so you can add your background first.
Absolutely.
And then do the top layer.
Yep.
Last. And that's because watercolour works better direct on paper. You were saying when you were working with acrylic you can sort of layer it and keep painting over, so this is why you use the
yeah, acrylic is so different to watercolour, you know. You can still layer your watercolour obviously, but it's just going to get darker and darker.
Yeah.
It's different. With acrylic I tend to work dark to light.
Yeah.
But with watercolour it's the opposite, so it's light to dark, yeah. Because you can't lighten watercolour very easily. You can always lighten acrylic. You can do anything with acrylic. You can paint over the top of it.
Yeah.
It's fine, but not this one. So I try not to leave this gum on for any great length of time. Like I don't like leaving it on for a couple of days or anything, because it does change the surface of the paper. And I try not to use it where I can, but on these instances you don't have much choice. Now I've got to be careful not to damage our little white stars. Okay, now I'll just draw our little possum back in here. This is just a very light 2H pencil, so that it's not very, it doesn't leave a lot of graphite on the paper, which is nice. I won't worry about masking his tail back in again, because the star is very light. So a lot of the times this is a guessing game of where that goes back in. It's like redrawing it. His little feet. Little hand in there. I'm trying to see, sometimes I can see the indent of where, I can just see the indent there of where it was before. his big chubby cheeks, this little guy. It just adds to the cuteness factor. Okay, so that's all good. Now I'll just put the lighter tones onto a possum first. And then while that first layer of possum is drying, we can paint the star. So he has some very pale tones. Paper towel is good for soaking up the excess water. Sometimes you end up with too much. There's a little bit of pink. Underneath there. These little hands. So these are just, this palette is watercolour tube and this palette is watercolour ink.
Okay.
Inks. So it's just a little bit different sometimes. Some pink into his ears. Some light tones around his eyes. And some lighter tones on the tail. So I always do the lighter tones first, so it's working light to dark on this little guy. And as I mentioned, the acrylics go the opposite. And sometimes I'll purposely work back into it when it is wet for a different effect, but for things like outlines and stuff, it needs to be dry before I can work back into it. Okay, and his nose is a little bit brighter, so we'll give him a brighter nose there. And his mouth. There we go. So that needs to dry a little bit. While that dries, we can put some of these other shades onto the star. Change brushes for that one. 2, 4. And we'll use a little bit more of acrylic back onto the star just to brighten it a little bit. even those stars, these stars, the way that I've painted them, you know, you think they'd just be white, but I like to put lots of little shadows and that sort of thing.
Dimension to them, doesn't it?
Yeah, adds some extra dimension, adds a bit of extra life, and particularly when I bring this nice little shadow through here, it makes him look like he's smiling.
Yeah. Kind of helps transform it from being just a flat image to almost 3D.
It does, yeah, it gives him some life and almost makes the star his own character in a way. Put some shadow back over the top of that. Just a very and you notice how the edges of my water pot lots of different colours. I think this water pot is about this is a water pot I had in uni, so it's quite a few years old, 20 odd years old. Let's just leave it at that. Let's just say it's 20 odd years old, yeah. And I don't know, I must be superstitious, but I don't ever clean it.
No, well,
no, it hasn't been cleaned on the outside since uni, so that's quite a bit. There's a lot of books on the outside of that one. My old illustration lecturer, George Tetlow, he was a fabulous artist, still is, and he had a water pot very similar to that. I thought, oh, I need one of those water pots. Might make me paint better.
The only way to get it is to paint a lot.
So yes, absolutely. Yes, that's true. Yep. So that's what I did. So just put a bit of yellow tone into that, and while that's wet, I'll work back into it. And the shadows, I never, as I mentioned before, I never use black because it's too dull. A lot of shadows I'll use purple, and that's exactly what I've done through here. So we'll put some purple in here just to add some shadow and some extra, little bit of extra depth. And I will outline this afterwards as well. So I'll put a bit more there. Okay, now while that star dries, before I outline him, we can get back to the possum. So I will jump backwards and forwards over the painting a lot, waiting for bits and pieces to dry all the time. Hurry up and dry, hurry up and dry. Watercolour takes longer to dry than acrylics, so that's a downside. But on the same token, I don't find I'm using as much paint, so that's okay. Now our little possum, I used some of our inks on this guy, and grey is not just grey. There's two. I have these things all made up beforehand when I get new sets of paints and things. This is my colour chart, so I can see I've got a warm grey and a cool grey. So I used a combination of the two for this little guy. This has more of a reddish tone, whereas the cool greys are more of a blue tone, so the warmer ones will make him a little bit more endearing. And just give him a little bit more depth as opposed to the cool ones. So I think that top part still needs to set a little bit more, so I'll work on his body in the meantime. outline his little feet in a minute too. And I will add some more tone, some more highlights back into him just with chalk pastel afterwards. All our white stars are dry there, which is good. I do like to use, well in this case, tissues or pieces of paper or something to lean on when I'm working as well, because just stops anything on your hands. You might think your hands are dry and clean, but they're not. And it stops anything from transferring through. So that's dry enough, which is nice to work back into this. One of the most important things too, like this about illustrating books, is you've got to be able to paint the same thing over and over, like to keep the consistency of the character throughout the book is so important. And a little bit extra
That's where all that planning would come into play, really getting to know the character. And
yeah, and knowing that you can draw and paint him in so many different positions. And then one of the books I did, Below Deck on the Sunken Wreck, there were so many characters in there I just had to write notes on what colours that I used, because I kept forgetting. And things like the series of Captain Kangaroo, you know, there's 5 books in that series, so I did have to make notes of what colours I used for Captain Kangaroo, because it's not just a brown or an orange.
Yeah.
There's like 5 different paints that made up his makeup. So for each book I had to remember what I'd used.
And you wouldn't have been working on all of them at the same time either.
No, they were years apart. I was working on other books in between. And you can see, like, I constantly refer back to the painting that I'd done before. That's one of the things I do when I'm working on the series of paintings, is I'll refer, and even if it's a different character, different spread, if there's things that need to be consistent throughout, then I'll refer back to it. But in some cases it's really hard, because with production schedules so tight, I'll start painting, and then after the first month, those first 5 pieces need to go off for scanning.
Yeah.
So I need to make sure that the next piece that I'm working on in that week, while they're being scanned, I don't need to actually refer back to.
Yeah.
To keep the consistency. So I'm always ringing them. You know, when can I get that artwork back? I need to look at it. That's all just an important part of keeping everything working. Lighten that one off a little bit. Our star is drying nicely, which is good. There's not a lot of detail in these little guys, which is nice. Some of the characters, that, like the dingo, took forever, it seemed to paint.
Because like you said, it's just not one colour, is it? It's almost
No,
making him
he
look
had
furry.
he had a lot of layers in him. For some reason the bilby didn't take that long, that one just worked. Just highlight his little cheeks. And doing little test pieces is a good way to see what's going to work. The book I've just finished, The Bush Santa, I actually didn't know what medium I was going to work in with that one. So I did test pieces in both acrylic and watercolour
Yeah.
And the watercolour seemed to work nicer for that storyline and for those images. I tried to make the acrylic work because I thought, well, that's just going to be easier. But no, the watercolour seemed nicer, so that's what that one ended up being done in. So we just have some grey on. This is a warm grey, and a little bit of sepia, the brown in there to bring some extra warmth and tone into his body. And prior to painting these little guys, you know, I get all my research and references. I print out like here's an example that for the bush Santa I had quokkas.
Yeah. So
I'll print out sheets of quokkas, images, lots of images, so I can see the tone and colour samples, etc. while I'm painting. That's all part of my research process. Outline his ears a little bit more. I have to make sure it's absolutely dry before I paint his nose and mouth, because if that bleeds, it's very hard to fix it. Whereas bleeding on his body like this is actually works. That sounds terrible, bleeding on his body, but the bleed of the paint works nicely to create the illusion of fur.
Yeah.
Sometimes I will use a little bit of acrylic to try and lighten things off a little bit if I want them a little bit lighter. But pretty much the watercolour is very unforgiving. Okay, so now while he's drying there, we can add some more into the star and into his tail. It literally is watching paint dry, isn't it?
It's mesmerising.
Yeah. I'll be working on something. I do a lot of painting on weekends. When my husband's home, so he can entertain our little boy while I work. And I'll be working on something. He'll come back 2 hours later and look at it and go, "What have you done?" "Oh, I painted that. Look, it looks great." He's like, "But you've hardly done anything." But if I, sometimes per character on some of those Captain Kangaroo books and things, each character would take an hour to paint. So yeah, he'd come back and I'd done 2 characters, and I always think it was fantastic that I've achieved a lot. He thinks I've achieved next to nothing. Let's outline his tail a little bit. And now I think his little hands and feet will be dry, so we can outline those. they just pop out of the page.
Yeah.
I do go through a lot of paintbrushes too. With the acrylics, I think I go through pretty much a whole set of paintbrushes from one book.
Wow. Is that because they wear down? Or
Yeah,
because
they wear, and I'm pretty harsh on them sometimes. I think when I do the backgrounds, I really put a lot. But doing all the detail, you know, your tips, I tend to lose my tips a little bit. So he's coming together nicely. Now, change palettes. This colour is a really nice one that I like to use a lot. This is a Moon Glow colour. It's called Moon Glow. It's a very dark purple. I tend to use this a lot instead of black as well, but making it lighter also made for nice outlines on the stars. Just to get it to pop out of the page a bit. There's so many different colours just in any objects that you look at. You know, observation is one of a big thing with painting. I remember going to a Hans Huyssen exhibition a few years ago, and you know, you'd look closely at the sheep, etc., that he painted, and there were vivid blues and reds and greens within the tones of the sheep, and you wouldn't think of putting that in normally, but it just gave it so much life. So I like doing that, adding extra colours in to create, it's almost like an illusion, I guess. That just made our star pop out a little bit more, which is great. Change palettes again. And now we can start highlighting some of his little facial features. It's important that these bits underneath are dry, because otherwise you don't get the sharp lines. eyes. And then we can add in one of my favourite parts is the highlights, the white highlights. They just make it at the end. A bit more. Sometimes when the colours dry back, you need to just work back into them a bit more to make it pop. Depends on the paper too, like this paper, Fabriano is this paper, it's nice and white, which is excellent, but it just eats the paint. So sometimes when it looks dark when you put it on, it dries back. So you need to go back and just sharpen things up. Okay. So we need a mixture of, I don't use black for his eyes, we're going to mix the moon glow. And we're also going to mix some of that indanthrone blue. That will give us a colour. You see, it's so much richer than black. And that brush is too furry in the end, so we will swap back. That one works. Also got to be careful not to drop water on it, that's not a good thing. That always worries me about these paintings before they get scanned. They're so easily damaged. Whereas the acrylic's totally different kettle of fish. Dry it back so we can highlight those a bit more. I remember when I was painting, I think it was it was Captain Kangaroo in the Bush Bash, and it was acrylic, which was lucky because I had it 3/4 of the way finished. My little boy came along and knocked the water pot. I went all over the painting. I was like, oh no! But luckily it was already dry.
Happy accident.
Oh yes. So I just had to basically wait for the paper to dry out, and it was okay. But oh my, if that had been these watercolors, that would have been history. So we get some expression in his eyes there. They're coming together. As it dries back, I tend to put an extra couple of layers on. I like the eyes to be rich. They need to look like they've got extra layers in there. A little bit more pink into his nose. a little bit extra tone into that top of the mouth there. That's just adding some of that Payne's grey on top of that to darken it even further. So he's coming up quite nicely. Add a bit more texture into the rest of his body there. Okay, those eyes need to dry at the moment, so we'll let them dry. We can add in some of the other detail. To make sure they're even. There we go. So they can dry back a bit more. Now all our little rings, etc., they are done in chalk pastel. My pastels are getting down a bit here. Almost time for a new one. And that is not a complicated process. So this just adds a bit extra glow. So they're quite light. These are almost worn down China graph pencils. They're an oil based. And they tend to pop a little bit more, so they're a little bit whiter. But you can't, with the chalk pastel, you know, you can rub back into it, etc. With these things, you can't. And I use these a lot, mainly on below deck on the sunken wreck water.
Yeah.
So they gave a great effect for that. Now, his eyes need to dry a bit more, but we can add some extra highlights into the rest of him. So this is where the acrylic comes back in. And these are just little things like the little whites in his nose, in his mouth. These are the little things that just make him pop out. And I like to put a little bit of white right in the corner of their eyes. That black is still drying, because it just
Makes him pop.
Yeah, it makes him pop. And it can also make them look like they're crying. So it can, it's a subtle way of making them very endearing. Gives you that awe factor, which is really nice. Highlights through there. We can add a bit more. A little bit of pastel to add some extra fluff to him. Paint is starting to dry out. I'm actually going to use a little bit more because I need it to be solid, not watered down. Highlights around the top. The good thing about the chalk pastels is you can use them to lighten things a little bit sometimes, but you can't paint back over them. I think those eyes are pretty much dry. I'm just flattening the brush as I get some more paint on here so I can get that edge. It's too dry. Highlights. That body there will be dry as well. Okay, he's almost there. Okay, last thing he needs is some whiskers. Now I'm not going to paint whiskers because they too hard. So I need nice sharp dark red pencil. And I like to give him so this is just hold this very lightly, so only just it's a nice edge on that one. And distributing there. Bit extra pencil went in there, so I'll just make that look like an extra star.
There he is.
And I think we're done.
That's beautiful.
There we go.
Thank you so much for sharing that gift with us.
That's
so
okay.
beautiful.
So when he dries totally, then I'll come back probably and just have a look and see if there's anything that jumps out at me that I need to fix or just highlight. And normally it's like little tiny, just a white dot here or a white dot there or something like that.
That's excellent. Thank you so much.
There we go.